The Darkened Room, A Winter's Haunting. The Darkened Room. It was a perfect winter evening. The cabin was warm, filled with the gentle hum of a crackling fire. Soft golden light bathed the room, bouncing off shelves lined with books and knickknacks, keepsakes from years of travel. In the kitchen, Emma stirred a pot of stew, the aroma of thyme and rosemary wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. Outside, the snow fell in fat, lazy flakes, blanketing the world in silence. It was her first weekend alone in the cabin she'd inherited from her grandmother, a retreat she'd dreamed of for months. Emma placed a bowl of stew on the table and pulled a thick quilt over her legs. The world felt far away, its chaos muted by the sturdy walls of the old cabin. As she sipped the steaming broth, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. But as the night deepened, the edges of that peace began to fray. It started subtly. The old grandfather clock in the corner, an heirloom that had never worked, let out a faint tick. At first Emma thought she imagined it. She dismissed it as the cabin settled the way old houses are. Later, when she turned to grab her book from the side table, she noticed the clock's hands had moved. Not much, just a few minutes forward. Her stomach tightened. Probably just the weight of the pendulum shifting, she muttered aloud, though she wasn't entirely sure that's how clocks worked. The snowstorm outside grew heavier, rattling the windows. Emma lit a few candles to supplement the firelight. Shadows stretched long across the room, and for the first time, she noticed how the carvings in the wooden beams above seemed to shift in the flickering light. The first real sign came just after midnight. Emma was sitting by the fire, thumbing through one of her grandmother's old books, when the cabin went eerily silent. The wind stopped, the crackling fire dulled, even the steady tick of the clock ceased. Then came the faint sound of footsteps overhead. Emma froze, the book slipping from her hands. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. The cabin only had one floor, there was no upstairs. The footsteps grew louder, moving deliberately from one end of the ceiling to the other. Her mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but these were not the soft, erratic sounds of an animal. These were heavy, deliberate steps. The fire sputtered, casting wild shadows across the room. The carvings in the beams seemed to twist and writhe, forming shapes her mind struggled to comprehend. Faces? No, just patterns. Surely just patterns. She grabbed the fire poker, gripping it tightly as the footsteps stopped. Then she heard a soft knock at the front door. The knock was followed by a voice. Emma! It was soft, familiar, and undeniably her grandmother's voice. Her breath caught. Her grandmother had been gone for over a year. Who's there? She managed, her voice trembling. Let me in, darling, it's so cold out here. Emma's knees buckled. She stumbled backward, shaking her head. No, you're not real. The door rattled. The windows shuddered. The carvings on the beams seemed to writhe more violently now, their shapes shifting into grotesque, gaping maws and wide, staring eyes. In desperation, Emma flung the door open, fire poker raised. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it a biting chill, and nothing else. The porch was empty, the snow undisturbed. Relief washed over her, though her hands still trembled. She shut the door, locked it, and piled logs onto the fire, trying to banish the chill from her bones. The footsteps, the knock, the voice, it was all in her head. The isolation was getting to her, that's all. But when she turned back toward the living room, she froze. The clock was now standing in the center of the room. Morning came, and with it a fragile sense of normalcy. The fire had burned low, leaving behind glowing embers. The shadows had retreated to the corners of the cabin where they belonged. Emma packed her things hurriedly, determined to leave. She would come back in spring, maybe. As she stepped outside, the snow glittered in the pale morning sun. The terror of the night seemed distant now, like a bad dream. She laughed nervously at herself. What a ridiculous imagination, she muttered. But as she turned to lock the door, her heart stopped. Her reflection in the glass of the window didn't move. It stared at her, a slow, malevolent smile spreading across its face as its eyes, her eyes, filled with an inky blackness. and then it raised a hand and knocked on the window.